during the Second World War, the U.S. economy just boomed. Industrial production more than tripled. It pulled the United States out of the Depression. It taught to the corporate managers who flocked to Washington the lesson that it was possible to maintain a private profit system as long as the government poured huge amounts of public funds into it. That was an extremely important lesson. The corporate managers who flocked to Washington to run the sort of semi-command economy that was very effective. Totalitarianism is an extremely efficient economic system. And during the Second World War, we had a kind of voluntary totalitarianism. People were dedicated to the war effort. Wages were kept down. There was allocation of resources. Profits went way up, I should say. The patriotic commitments extend only so far. But the results were that there was an enormous concentration of private capital and a tremendous industrial capacity, but nobody to buy the goods, because most of the rest of the world was either pretty seriously damaged or completely destroyed. So on the one hand, the capital had to be invested, and had to be invested abroad. And the richest places for investment, the most profitable, were at that time not places like Indonesia, but places like Western Europe and Japan. So they had to be reconstructed as areas for investment of U.S. capital, along with Canada. And then it was necessary to rebuild markets for U.S. industrial production. Otherwise, the U.S. would be in trouble. And the markets could only be the other wealthy industrial powers on any substantial scale, at least. So on the one hand, it was necessary to maintain the disparity by violence, if necessary. On the other hand, it was necessary to reconstruct the wealthy industrial societies around Japan and Germany, our recent enemies, and reconstitute for them the imperial systems that enabled them to maintain their wealth and power. This meant that the economic planning was quite sophisticated, and it was very thought out in considerable detail. The idea was to set up triangular trade patterns whereby the United States would purchase raw materials from the colonies of the West, say from rubber from Malaya, which was a British colony, say, and so on, and the dollars that go to the purchase of these commodities would go back to the mother country, essentially. And that was supposed to be true even after independence, because the independence was supposed to be kind of like a mask for maintaining the old imperial relations. So the effect would be that U.S. purchase of raw materials from the Third World would provide dollars to the imperial countries, and they would then be able to purchase U.S. manufactured products with those dollars, thus overcoming what was called the dollar gap. The dollar gap was a major problem for American planners right in the end of the Second World War. In fact, the dollar gap was really only overcome by the huge military expenditures, the huge rearmament programs, which revitalized the Japanese economy and revitalized the European economies, and did in fact provide them dollars to maintain the viability of the system, while the same military spending maintained the U.S. economy. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the first international problem was reconstitute the major industrial powers. Various means were tried. The one that triangular trade patterns were part of it. The other one that succeeded was was sometimes called international military Keynesianism, public funding of military systems which revitalized the rich industrial societies. Now, of course, that meant that the Third World, the former colonies, had to maintain their had to be compelled to maintain their subordinate relations to the rich industrial countries, even though there was decolonization going on. So the United States was at war virtually with Third World nationalism from the very beginning, and for very substantial reasons. And this was well understood. It was understood that, and in fact, if you look at the State Department planning, say the Kennan's staff in the late 40s, sort of spelling out the details of grand area planning, they simply parceled the world out to the different imperial centers. The United States was going to take for itself the Western Hemisphere, what the Secretary of War called our little region over here, which has never bothered anybody. So that meant kicking out our traditional enemies, Britain and France, and they were summarily dismissed, and the U.S. took total control over the Western Hemisphere. The other area that where the U.S. was not going to brook any interference was the Middle East, which was described as the greatest strategic prize in history, an unparalleled source of wealth because of its oil. So the British were allowed in. They were considered kind of clients or lieutenants, but nobody else was. That had to be run completely by U.S. oil companies and by the United States. And in fact, the Monroe Doctrine was more or less extended to the Middle East. So these regions would be U.S. fiefdoms, Latin America and the Middle East, the oil-producing regions, but the other areas were kind of distributed. Africa was to be handed over to Europe to be exploited, as George Kennan put it, again expressing the more humanist end of to be exploited for its reconstruction, more humanist end of the spectrum, because the U.S. didn't care much about Africa, so the Europeans could have that one. Southeast Asia was to be a source of resources and raw materials for the Western powers, and the imperial systems would in effect be reconstructed. Japan's empire toward the south, the British system, the Dutch system, and so on, sometimes under the mask of independence, but sometimes just kept as colonies. The Vietnam War grows out of that. There were problems in implementing this. One problem was that over the whole world, in fact, the anti-fascist resistance had a lot of prestige, and the traditional conservative order was more or less very much discredited by its association with fascism and Nazism. But the U.S. intended to reconstruct the traditional conservative order and the traditional power relations and to undermine and dismantle the anti-fascist resistance, which was worker and peasant based very often, and radical democratic or social democratic or communist or something like that in its orientation. And this had to be done all over the world, and it was done in different ways. In some countries it was done with extreme violence. So in South Korea, for example, about 100,000 people were killed by the U.S. forces and the U.S. client regime before what we call the Korean War. That's not called the Korean War. Korean War is supposed to be 1950, but it was in fact an episode in an ongoing struggle after the dismantling and destruction of the anti-fascist resistance, indeed even using Japanese police and military forces as clients. In Greece, about 160,000 people were killed as the Nazi collaborators and former wealthy sectors were reinstated, and the anti-fascist resistance, worker and peasant-based, which had fought quite a significant war. It had held down 6 or 7 German divisions. It was dismantled and destroyed. In other countries, it was done in other ways, but it was done everywhere. This was a uniform policy. And in fact, it did pretty much restore the traditional conservative order. Italy was the main target of U.S. subversion. It's not too well known, but the major CIA activities, as far as we know, as far as has been publicized, from 1947, when the CIA was founded, up until 1975, when the record runs dry. We don't know the subsequent record, but because there aren't documents. But during that period, Italy appears to have been the prime target of subversion, and the subversion was taken very seriously to block and undermine Italian democracy, because it was going to be worker-based or social democratic or something like that. The U.S. took it extremely seriously. The 1948 election in Italy, the first National Security Council documents, NSC-1, in fact, they go in order. The first one, NSC-1, is concerned with Italy, and it's concerned with what would happen if the communists, which means the working class-based political organization, if they won the election, as everyone expected they would. The U.S. Secretly was committed to calling a national emergency, getting the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean in action, and in fact starting paramilitary guerrilla operations in Italy to overthrow the government in case the wrong people won the democratic election.